By January 1547, Henry VIII's body had become so grotesquely diseased that his own courtiers struggled not to vomit in his presence. The once magnificent king now weighed nearly 400 pounds, his legs riddled with infected ulcers that leaked pus, and emitted a stench so foul that perfumed handkerchiefs became mandatory for anyone entering the royal chamber, because the man who had executed 2 wives and countless enemies would face his own end in the most humiliating way possible. Rotting alive while still wearing the crown. Whitehall Palace, January 1547. The corridors that had once echoed with the footsteps of England's most feared king now carried a different sound, the agonized screams of a dying tyrant, whose body had betrayed him as completely as he had betrayed others. Henry VIII, at 56, was barely recognizable as the athletic prince who had once jousted with Europe's finest knights. What lay gasping in the royal bedchamber was something closer to a living corpse, a mountainous bulk of diseased flesh, wrapped in ermine and cloth of gold. The transformation had been decades in the making. Multiple jousting accidents had damaged his legs, creating wounds that never properly healed. His legendary appetite had swollen his frame to monstrous proportions. But it was the ulcers that made him truly horrifying. The king's legs, whispered one court physician to another. They smell like a charnel house. The infected wounds ran from his ankles to his thighs, weeping constantly with a mixture of pus and blood. The stench was so overwhelming that servants were forced to burn incense continuously, and even then, many fled the room retching. Henry's face had become a bloated mask, his once piercing eyes now sunken deep into yellowing flesh. His breathing came in labored gasps, each movement triggering waves of agony that made the king who had terrorized England cry out like a wounded animal. "Bring me relief," he roared during his lucid moments, but his physicians had exhausted every remedy. Bloodletting, herbal concoctions, even applications of live pigeons cut in half and pressed against his wounds. Nothing worked. The royal bed had been specially reinforced to support his enormous weight, but even the strongest timbers groaned under the mass of putrefying flesh. Servants worked in shifts, some tasked with the nauseating job of cleaning the constant discharge from his ulcers. Palace workers reported hearing the king's screams echoing through Whitehall's stone corridors, a sound that haunted their nightmares for years afterward. The psychological torment matched the physical decay. Henry, who had once commanded absolute obedience from millions, now found himself helpless against his own rotting flesh. Court records reveal increasingly erratic behavior as his mind began to deteriorate alongside his body. He speaks to ghosts, reported Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in a private letter. Last night he called out for Anne Boleyn, begging her forgiveness. Then he screamed at Thomas More, claiming the dead Chancellor was standing at the foot of his bed. The king's legendary temper had twisted into something even more terrifying. Servants reported that Henry would rage against his own body, demanding that his physicians cure him through sheer force of royal will. When they failed, he would threaten executions, signing death warrants even as his hands shook uncontrollably. But it was the smell that truly revealed how far the mighty had fallen. The royal chamber reeked of decay so profound that even hardened courtiers, men who had witnessed executions and battlefield carnage, fled gagging into the corridors. Windows must be flung open despite the winter cold, noted one court. Diary: the king's condition has become unspeakable. Henry's ulcers had grown so severe that bone was reportedly visible through the necrotic tissue. His physicians applied increasingly desperate remedies: boiled onions, powdered human skull, even concoctions containing gold dust. Nothing provided relief. The only effective treatment was opium. But the drug that dulled his physical agony also clouded his already deteriorating mind. Court observers described a king who would drift between periods of narcotic, stupor, and explosive rage, creating an atmosphere of terror among those forced to tend him. His Majesty no longer resembles a man, one attendant confided to his diary. What lies in that bed is something from a nightmare. The conspiracy of silence surrounding Henry's condition became one of the most closely guarded secrets in English history. Official proclamations continued to describe the king as hale and hearty, while the reality was a horror show that defied description. Even Queen Catherine Parr, his sixth wife, was kept at a distance during the worst episodes, unable to bear witness to what her husband had become. By February 1547, even the elaborate pretense of recovery could no longer be maintained. Henry's body had begun decomposing while he still lived, creating a macabre spectacle that traumatized everyone forced to witness it. The royal physicians worked frantically to manage the king's failing bodily functions. Teams of servants labored in shifts to clean and move the massive, putrefying form, a task so revolting that many resigned their positions rather than continue. "The king's legs have turned black," reported one court physician. "The infection spreads daily. We can do nothing but pray and apply more opium." Henry's weight had ballooned to an estimated 400 pounds, requiring mechanical devices just to move him in bed. His face had become so distorted by disease that some courtiers claimed they could no longer recognize the man who had once been considered the most handsome prince in Europe. The psychological impact extended beyond the king himself. Court records reveal a pattern of nervous breakdowns among royal attendants. Several committed suicide rather than continue serving in the death chamber, while others simply fled London without permission. "No man should have to witness what we have seen," wrote one former page. "His Majesty has become a living reminder of mortality's cruelest jokes." The stench had become so overwhelming that perfumed handkerchiefs were no longer sufficient. Courtiers began wearing special masks soaked in aromatic oils, creating a bizarre procession of figures who looked more like plague doctors than royal attendants. But perhaps most disturbing was the sound. Henry's constant moaning and occasional screams echoed through Whitehall Palace, creating an atmosphere of dread that infected everyone within its walls. "The very stones seem to weep," observed one visitor. "This palace has become a tomb for the living." The king's mental state deteriorated alongside his physical condition. He would demand to be dressed in his finest robes, only to soil them within hours. He insisted on wearing his crown even while bedridden, the golden circlet sitting askew on his diseased skull, like a mockery of earthly power. During his final weeks, Henry became obsessed with controlling his legacy, frantically dictating changes to his will while struggling to speak through lips cracked and bleeding from fever. January 27, 1547 marked the beginning of Henry's final collapse. Witnesses reported a seizure so violent that multiple attendants had to hold him down to prevent self-injury. When it passed, the king's right side was partially paralyzed, clear evidence of the massive stroke that would finish what disease had started. The royal physicians, knowing their own lives might depend on saving their patient, applied increasingly desperate measures. They pressed hot irons against his flesh, forced bitter medicinal concoctions down his throat, and even attempted primitive forms of what would later be called shock therapy. "His Majesty no longer speaks coherently," noted Archbishop Cranmer. "He makes sounds, terrible sounds, but they are barely human." Access to the royal bedchamber was now restricted to only the most essential personnel, each sworn to absolute secrecy. The conspiracy of silence served a practical purpose. News of the king's actual condition could trigger civil war or foreign invasion. Even in his final extremity, Henry's presence dominated the room like a grotesque monument to earthly powers. Limitations. The man who had reshaped England's religious landscape, executed queens and nobles with impunity, and struck terror into the hearts of millions, now lay helpless against his own flesh's rebellion. Court records described the king alternately begging for death and raging against its approach. In his clearer moments, he would demand that his physicians restore him through royal command, as if his will alone could reverse the biological processes destroying him. "Cure me," he reportedly screamed during one particularly lucid episode. "I am the King of England. My body will obey me." But death recognizes no earthly authority. As February approached, Henry's breathing became increasingly labored. The infected ulcers had progressed to such a state that gangrene was setting in, filling the royal chamber with the sweet, sickening smell of rotting flesh. The king, who had once symbolized England's vigor and power, had become a living warning about mortality's universal dominion. His courtiers, forced to witness this daily degradation of absolute power, began to understand that no amount of wealth or authority could protect them from their own eventual decay. As February progressed, Henry drifted between consciousness and delirium. During brief lucid periods, he reportedly expressed growing terror about facing divine judgment. The man who had executed thousands now confronted his own mortality with the same fear he had instilled in others. "He begs forgiveness in his sleep," recorded one attendant. But even God's mercy may not extend to such sins. The end came before dawn on January 28, 1547. Henry VIII, the most feared man in England, died not in battle or grand ceremony, but choking on his own fluids, while his massive body finally surrendered to the infections that had been consuming him for years. Even in death, his enormous physical presence dominated the royal chamber. The corpse was a grotesque monument to excess and suffering. Nearly 400 pounds of diseased flesh that had once contained the will of a king. The immediate aftermath revealed the true horror of Henry's final condition. Court records document that the royal corpse began decomposing with alarming speed, likely due to the advanced infections already present. Embalmers worked frantically, but were reportedly shocked by the state of his internal organs. The king's coffin required special construction to accommodate his enormous girth, nearly twice the width of a standard noble's casket. During the lying in state at Whitehall, witnesses reported that the lead-lined coffin actually split under pressure from gases building within the decomposing body. The very coffin leaked, noted one horrified observer. Dogs came to lick at the seepage, a final indignity for a king obsessed with majesty. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came in the king's private chambers after his death. Among the expected trappings of royal power, servants found evidence of his final torment: bedsheets soaked with discharge, walls stained with the fluids his body had constantly leaked, and makeshift medical equipment that revealed the desperate measures taken to keep him alive. The conspiracy of silence that had surrounded Henry's condition was maintained, even after death. For 3 full days, the Privy Council suppressed news of the king's passing while consolidating power around his 9-year-old heir, Edward VI. The disposal of Henry's remains became a nightmare that revealed the true extent of his physical deterioration. The royal corpse decomposed so rapidly that even experienced embalmers were overwhelmed by the task. They removed his internal organs, finding a diseased liver and grotesquely enlarged heart that spoke to years of excess and infection. Henry's funeral procession to Windsor Castle provided one final display of royal power, but it was built on a lie. While black-draped horses pulled the massive coffin through streets lined with mourners, what lay inside bore no resemblance to the vital king. Depicted in official portraits, the coffin's journey became a logistical nightmare. Its enormous weight required additional bearers, and reports suggest it leaked continuously, despite the lead lining. Palace officials had to constantly clean the route behind the funeral cortege, removing the physical evidence of royal decay. St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. Henry was finally laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who had given him a son, and the only one spared from his eventual wrath by dying first. But even burial couldn't contain the horror of what he had become. Workers reported that the tomb continued to emit disturbing odors for months after interment. Some claimed they could hear strange sounds emanating from beneath the chapel floor. Though these were likely just the gases produced by continued decomposition, the medical legacy of Henry's death provided valuable, if horrifying, insights into Tudor medicine's limitations. His physicians had kept detailed records of every treatment attempted, creating a catalogue of futile remedies that revealed the helplessness of even royal medicine against advanced disease. Modern analysis suggests Henry suffered from type 2 diabetes, severe gout, and chronic osteomyelitis, a trifecta of conditions that would have made his final years a living hell. His estimated weight of 400 pounds, combined with infected leg ulcers and poor circulation, created perfect conditions for the sepsis that ultimately killed him. Perhaps most revealing is what Henry's death taught his subjects about the limitations of absolute power. The man who had commanded the life and death of millions, who had reshaped England's religious landscape through pure force of will, ultimately proved as vulnerable to disease and decay as the humblest peasant. His courtiers, forced to witness this daily reminder of mortality's universal dominion, carried the trauma for years. Many suffered what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, unable to forget the sight and smell of their king's living decomposition. The rotting king had taught England a lesson more powerful than any sermon. No earthly power, however absolute, can protect against the democracy of death. In his final degradation, Henry VIII achieved a connection with common humanity that had eluded him throughout his reign. We all face the same end, regardless of the crowns we wear.